Frost was already spidering across the inside of the porch window by the time Eleanor Calder understood, with total clarity, that her husband had locked her out of her own house. Somewhere behind that glass, in the amber glow of a fire she had paid to have built into the wall. 11 years ago, Marcus Doyle was laughing with his hand wrapped around a woman young enough to be his intern, and neither of them had the faintest idea that, within 4 hours, the name on every account, every deed, and every employment contract in that house would no longer answer to either of them. They thought they had won something. They had only just discovered how much there was to lose. The wind coming off Lake Ontario that night had teeth in it. Eleanor stood barefoot on the limestone steps of the Rosedale house in a thin cotton nightgown, her breath fogging in front of her, watching Bianca Reyes point through the bay window and mouth something to Marcus that made him throw his head back and laugh. Bianca was wearing Eleanor's cashmere robe, the pale gray one from the trip to Reykjavik, the one Marcus had actually picked out himself, a small detail that stung more than it should have. The two of them stood in front of the fireplace like a photograph out of a real estate brochure, golden and warm and utterly convinced they had just put a helpless, unremarkable woman out into a February storm to freeze and beg. It had not begun as a fight. It never did with Marcus. It began, as it always did, with Eleanor asking a quiet, ordinary question. She'd found the statement folded inside his overcoat pocket while she was hanging it in the front closet, a coat she'd had dry cleaned for him 100 times without ever once checking the pockets, except that this time a corner of paper had been sticking out, catching the light. A wire transfer, $190,000, routed out of the joint line of credit into something called Halyard Advisory Group, incorporated in Alberta 3 weeks earlier. She had asked him about it over dinner, calmly, the way you'd ask about a grocery bill that seemed a little high. Marcus had not denied it. He had barely looked up from his plate. "You wouldn't understand it if I explained it," he'd said, and when she pressed, gently, still gently, because 11 years of practice had taught her that gentle was the only register that didn't make things worse. His face had done the thing it always did, the thing that had once seemed like passion, and now, finally, at 36 years old, she recognized for what it actually was. Contempt with the volume turned up. "You want to know where your precious money went, Eleanor? It's not your money. It never was. You've never earned a nickel of it in your life." That was when Bianca had come down the stairs in the Robe, unhurried, as if she lived there, because by then, in every way that mattered to Marcus, she did. "Tell her about the condo," Bianca had said, resting her chin on his shoulder, with the easy proprietary comfort of someone who had done this before, more than once. And Eleanor had simply stood there in her own kitchen, holding a folded bank statement, while her husband explained, almost bored, that he'd bought a 2-bedroom unit on the harbor front for a woman 12 years younger than his wife, using money that had come, every dollar of it, from an account Eleanor had never once been late paying into. She had not screamed. She had not thrown anything, though there was a part of her, a very old, very tired part, that wanted to. She had simply said she wasn't leaving, that the house was in both their names, that he could not simply move a mistress into a marriage and expect her to pack a bag like a guest, overstaying her welcome. That was when Marcus had crossed the kitchen, taken her by the upper arm hard enough to bruise, and walked her, not dragged, walked because Marcus was too careful a man to leave marks that photographed well, down the front hall and out onto the porch. "Go cool off," he'd told her, the way you'd speak to a dog that had chewed a shoe. "Come back in when you remember whose name is on the mortgage." The deadbolt had turned with a sound Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life, not because it was loud, because it was final, because it was the sound of a man who genuinely, sincerely, with his whole small heart, believed he had just won. Eleanor stood on the porch and watched, through the sidelight window, as Marcus rejoined Bianca by the fire. Bianca turned, caught sight of her framed in the dark glass, shivering in her nightgown on the ice-slicked steps, and pointed, laughed, raised an invisible toast in Eleanor's direction. Marcus kissed the side of her neck without breaking eye contact with the window, a performance for an audience of one. And Eleanor understood in that moment that this was not an argument that had gotten out of hand. This was a message. They wanted her to see them warm. They wanted her to know, with total certainty, who mattered in this house and who did not. What Marcus did not know, what he had never once bothered to ask in 11 years of marriage, because he had never once considered that the answer might matter, was that the woman he had just shoved out into a wind chill of -14 was not, and had never been, the mild-mannered gallery archivist from Kitchener he believed he'd married. Eleanor Voss did not exist. She never had. The name on the marriage certificate was a name Eleanor had built herself, carefully, deliberately, at 23 years old, with the full cooperation of a family that had the resources to make a person disappear into an entirely new life and reappear exactly where she wanted to be found. Her real name was Eleanor Calder. Her father was Julian. No, her father was Alistair Calder. And if that name meant nothing to Marcus, it was only because Alistair Calder had spent 4 decades making very sure it meant nothing to anyone. Calder Dominion Holdings did not have a public profile. It did not appear on rich lists. It owned grain terminals in Thunder Bay, a controlling stake in a shipping conglomerate out of Halifax, half a dozen mid-sized banks under other people's names, and, as of 3 weeks earlier, a 62% stake in the parent company of Vantage Rayland Group, the firm where Marcus Doyle had spent the last 9 years climbing toward a vice presidency he believed he had earned through talent alone. Eleanor had grown up watching money hollow people out. She had watched cousins become paranoid, watched aunts stop trusting their own reflections, watched her father grow so suspicious of affection that he'd once had a girlfriend's dental records pulled before their 3rd date. At 22, she had gone to him and asked for something no Calder had ever asked for: to disappear. To be ordinary. To find out just once whether anyone could love her without knowing what she was worth on paper. Alistair had agreed on one condition: she would remain, invisibly, under the family's protection. The modest condo she'd told Marcus she rented when they met had in fact been purchased outright by a numbered company that reported, eventually, to her father's office. The gallery in Yorkville where she'd told him she worked as an archivist was a tax write-off, dressed up as a small business, fully funded, its books quietly balanced by an accountant who had never once met the actual owner, and the house on Highgate Crescent, the one Marcus had just locked her out of, the one with the wine cellar and the heated driveway he loved to mention at dinner parties. Marcus had never owned a single brick of it. 3 years into the marriage, when Marcus had grown desperate to move into Rosedale to impress the partners at his firm, his mortgage application had been quietly declined. He was buried in debt from a failed investment he'd hidden from Eleanor entirely. She'd only learned of it later, through the same channels that told her everything else about her husband that he never volunteered himself. Rather than let him unravel in public, rather than watch his ego crumble at a dinner party, Eleanor had arranged, through a Calder proxy, to purchase the house outright in cash. A fictitious rent-to-own arrangement, dressed up through a shell lender, had let Marcus believe he was paying down a mortgage for 3 years. Every payment he'd made had gone, in truth, into an environmental trust fund registered in Eleanor's own name. He was not a homeowner. He had never been a homeowner. He was legally a long-term guest who paid rent to no one. Eleanor crossed the frozen lawn in her bare feet, the cold biting so sharply it had stopped registering as pain and become something closer to a low, steady hum. She bypassed the heated garage where Marcus's Audi sat gleaming and undisturbed and made her way to the side of the driveway, where her own car sat, exposed to the storm, a nondescript gray Volvo wagon that Marcus had complained about more than once. Embarrassed by how it looked next to the neighbors' cars, he did not know it had reinforced glass, run-flat tires, and a satellite uplink built into the dash, standard equipment for anything Eleanor drove, non-negotiable as far as her father's security detail was concerned. She slid into the driver's seat, slammed the door against the wind, and sat there for a long moment in the sudden, ringing silence, watching rain streak sideways across the windshield under the porch light. 11 years. She had cooked his dinners, memorized his allergies, learned to laugh at jokes that weren't funny, made herself smaller and smaller, until she'd nearly forgotten what the original size had been. She had told herself, for years, that beneath the arrogance there was a good man trying his best. Tonight that particular lie had finally completely run out of road. She picked up her phone, not the one Marcus knew about, the other one, the one buried 3 folders deep behind an encrypted shell, unlocked with a 12-digit code and a retinal scan that turned the screen a deep, glowing red. One contact, Weston Cole. Weston had been her father's fixer for as long as she could remember, a former Crown prosecutor turned private problem solver, the kind of man who did not raise his voice because he had never once needed to. She had not called him in almost 3 years. Not since he'd quietly arranged the fake mortgage and warned her, in that same flat, unbothered voice, that Marcus Doyle was a grifter with good tailoring. She had told him he was wrong. She had not wanted to hear it. He picked up on the first ring. Eleanor, I'm sorry to wake you. I don't sleep when a Calder line lights up. A pause, the faint sound of typing already starting somewhere on his end. Your beacon has you parked outside the Highgate property. Are you hurt? I'm in the car. Marcus locked me out. It's -14, and I'm in a nightgown. She kept her voice level, though her teeth wanted to chatter around the words. He put his hands on me to do it. The silence on the line went from professional to something colder. I'm dispatching an extraction team now. Medical will follow. No, she said it sharply enough to surprise herself. I don't want him touched. I want something else. Understood, Weston said after a moment, in the tone of a man recalibrating an entire operation in real time. What are your parameters? Eleanor looked through the rain-blurred windshield at the glowing windows of the house, at the two silhouettes still moving comfortably in front of the fire. Drinking her wine, warmed by heat she was now paying to keep running. I want everything he thinks he has to stop existing. Tonight. I don't want him arrested. I want him to understand, in real time, exactly how small he actually is. Full liquidation then. Financial, professional, social. Weston's voice had gone very quiet, very precise. Once I start this, Eleanor, there's no half measure. His career ends tonight. So does hers. Start with Vantage Rayland, Eleanor said. We control the parent company now, correct? As of 3 weeks ago. 62% through the London Proxy Fund. A short, humorless laugh. Marcus Doyle has been working for you since the second week of January and has no idea. Fire him. Effective immediately, for cause. He wired $190,000 out of our joint line of credit into a numbered company called Halyard Advisory 3 weeks ago. I want to know where every cent of that came from. If it's client money, flag it to the OSC and let them do what they do. It's client money, Weston said, and she could hear him confirming it even as he said it, keys clicking. Sloppily hidden. He routed it through a Cayman intermediary, but the login traces straight back to his home IP. That's fraud, Eleanor. Clean and stupid. Freeze everything. Checking, savings, the RRSP, whatever crypto he thinks I don't know about. And Bianca Reyes. She's on staff at Vantage too. She's the beneficiary of the condo he bought with that money. Co-conspirator. Terminate her as well. Freeze what's hers. And the house. Eleanor's eyes stayed fixed on the window, on Bianca's silhouette laughing at something wrapped in the gray robe. Cut the utilities. Power, gas, water, the smart home network. All of it. No police yet. I want to watch it fall apart around them first. Commencing, Weston said. Good hunting, Eleanor. The line went dead. She set the phone on the passenger seat and folded her arms, watching the house the way a hawk watches a field. In her head, she counted down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The chandelier in the front hall flickered once, twice, and went out. A heartbeat later, every light in the house died at once, plunging the property into total, absolute black. Inside, Marcus did not panic at first. Men like Marcus did not panic over a fuse. He assumed the storm had taken down a line somewhere along the crescent, felt his way to the breaker panel in the mudroom by the light of his phone, and found every switch sitting exactly where it should be, untripped. His cell signal, usually a flawless 5 bars, had collapsed to a blinking SOS. Cheap network, he muttered and went to check on the generator he'd insisted on installing 2 years earlier, at a cost that had made even him wince. It should have kicked in within 10 seconds of the outage. It had been nearly 3 minutes, and the digital panel on the unit sat completely dark, the fuel line silently disabled by a cyber team 600 kilometers away, who had walked straight into his smart home network through a login he'd never bothered to change from the factory default. The water went next, a wet hiss from the tap, a few rust-colored drops, and then nothing. Bianca, wrapped in a throw blanket by then, complaining that her phone had no signal either, was starting to sound less amused. Marcus told her to put on a sweater. He was still telling himself this was bad luck, a coincidence of infrastructure, right up until he opened the front door to check on his wife. Planning, he would later be forced to admit to himself, to let her back in only after she'd apologized properly. Only after she understood exactly whose house this was, and found the porch empty except for pooling rainwater. Her Volvo sat idling at the edge of the driveway, headlights dark, taillights glowing faint red through the sheeting rain. Stubborn, he thought, and shut the door again, threw the deadbolt, and did not once consider that. From inside that car, she was watching him. By 2 in the morning, the temperature inside the house had dropped into single digits. Marcus and Bianca had dragged the comforters down from the bedroom, and were huddled together on the study sofa, Bianca crying quietly about her dead phone. Marcus staring at the ceiling, and rehearsing the conversation he'd have with a contractor in the morning. Still certain, this was simply an inconvenience he would bill to his expense account. It was the corporate satellite phone on his desk that finally woke the house. A hard blue light, cutting through the dark, a single notification glowing on the screen. Vantage Rayland HR. Subject line in capitals. Immediate termination of employment. He read it twice before his hands started shaking. Gross misconduct. Breach of fiduciary duty. Unauthorized diversion of client funds. All corporate access revoked, effective immediately. Legal counsel had already notified the Ontario Securities Commission regarding the Halyard transfer. An internal audit like that took months at a firm the size of Vantage. It had taken hours. He didn't understand it, couldn't understand it, right up until he opened his banking app, with hands gone clumsy from cold and adrenaline, and found a padlock icon where his balance should have been. Account restricted. Suspected fraud. His investment portfolio, nearly $800,000 he'd quietly built as an exit fund, now read. Assets frozen pending investigation. He was, on paper, still a wealthy man. In every practical sense, he did not have a single dollar to his name. He tried the offshore account last, the one he'd used to move the Halyard money, entering the 3 layers of authentication with fingers gone numb. The balance came back at 0. Beneath the 0, in plain text, was a message that had bypassed every automated system to land directly in front of him. Did you really think no one was watching the ledger? WC. He didn't know who WC was. He didn't need to. Something about those 4 words told him, with total clarity, that this was not bad luck. Someone with total, effortless access to his entire financial existence was dismantling it on purpose and enjoying it. That was when Bianca's phone, dead for hours, lit up on its own with a single forced text alert. Her face went white as she read it. Terminated from Vantage. Named as an accessory. Her personal accounts frozen. What did you do? She screamed at him, standing up, the robe slipping off one shoulder. You told me the condo money was a signing bonus. You told me we were fine. Shut up and let me think, Marcus snapped, though there was nothing left in his voice but panic. For the first time all night, he thought of his wife, alone in a car in the driveway, the woman he'd dismissed 100 times as harmless, unambitious, grateful. Eleanor works at a gallery, he told himself. She's nobody. But the timing sat in his stomach like a stone. Before he could chase the thought any further, headlights swept across the front windows. Not one car, but 2. Black SUVs, pulling through the curb, boxing in the driveway with the deliberate precision of people who had done this many times before. 4 men in tactical rain gear stepped out and moved across the lawn without hurrying, because they didn't need to hurry. There was nowhere for anyone in that house to go. The knock, when it came, was not a knock. It was a fist against the door 3 times, followed by a voice through a megaphone that carried the flat, bureaucratic menace of absolute legal certainty. Marcus Doyle, this property is under the control of Calder Dominion Trust. You are currently trespassing. Open the door, or it will be opened for you. He called 911 on the satellite phone, screaming about armed men, about home invasion, and the dispatcher, after a pause, after the sound of typing, told him, almost gently, that local police had already logged an emergency eviction order for that address, executed by a licensed private firm, and had been instructed to stand down and observe only. For your own safety, sir, she said, I'd advise you to comply. The line went dead before he could ask her what that meant. They didn't use a battering ram. They used a hydraulic spreader, the kind used to pry open collapsed vehicles, and the sound of the front door frame splintering was, to Marcus, the loudest thing he had ever heard in his life. Flashlight beams swept the foyer, pinning him against the wall beneath the staircase, Bianca crumpling to the floor with her arms over her head. A tall man in a waterproof jacket, a name tape reading Delhi stitched above the pocket, stepped forward and held out a thick manila envelope without ceremony. You're being served. Emergency eviction, signed by a federal judge at 1:15 this morning. You're trespassing on property owned by Calder Dominion Trust. There's also a civil suit from Vantage Rayland regarding the Halyard transfer, and a protection order filed on behalf of your wife, Eleanor Calder. Her name is Eleanor Voss, Marcus said, and heard how thin his own voice sounded. No, Delaney said, not unkindly, and let the envelope drop to the wet floor. It isn't. You have 5 minutes to pack 1 bag. Anything purchased with joint funds stays. Your car's already being loaded onto a flatbed. It was leased through a Vantage subsidiary, and your corporate privileges ended 40 minutes ago. Bianca, sobbing now, crawled out from behind the sofa, still wearing the ruined robe. Mascara tracked down both cheeks. I didn't have anything to do with this, she said to Delaney. He lied to me. He told me the money was his. You're named as a co-conspirator in a federal fraud investigation, Delaney told her, without inflection. You're also trespassing. You leave with what you arrived with, nothing more. They were walked out onto the porch within minutes. No time to gather anything. The freezing rain soaking through Marcus's pajamas and pasting the robe to Bianca's skin as they stumbled down the driveway watching his Audi hauled onto a tow truck under the streetlight. At the curb, they found the gray Volvo still idling, engine humming. And as Marcus approached, the window rolled down with a soft electric whir, releasing a wave of warm air that smelled faintly of coffee and leather. Eleanor sat behind the wheel, dry, composed, entirely still. The woman who had spent 11 years apologizing for things that weren't her fault was, for the first time in Marcus's memory, simply looking at him. Eleanor, he said, and his voice cracked on the second syllable. Please, I don't understand what's happening. Let me in the car. We can talk about this. Bianca pressed in beside him, shivering violently. Please, she said. I didn't know he was married when. I didn't know any of it. My accounts are frozen. I have nowhere to go. Eleanor looked at them the way you might look at something you'd stepped over on the sidewalk. Not with hatred. Hatred would have meant they still mattered. You locked me out, Marcus, she said, her voice perfectly level under the rain. You told me to cool off until I remembered whose name was on the mortgage. I was drunk. I was angry. You were going through my things. You took my job, he said instead, desperate now, grasping at the window frame with both hands. You took my money. You took my house. I didn't take anything, Eleanor said. I stopped protecting you from what you actually are. The house was always mine. Your job existed, because my family owns the company you worked for. The money you stole was mine to begin with. I let you believe you'd built something, so I could have a peaceful life. And you used that peace to try to break me in front of a woman you brought into my kitchen. Marcus's mouth opened and nothing came out. Behind him, Delaney's team was already inside the shattered front door, securing a house that had never, not for one single day, belonged to him. I have nothing, he finally said, and it wasn't performance this time. It was true, and he could hear that it was true, and hearing it seemed to break something in him that had been holding since the kitchen. Eleanor, I have absolutely nothing left. You have each other, Eleanor said, and let her gaze move briefly to Bianca. You told me back at the house that the cold helps people remember who's actually in charge. I think you were right. She pressed a button on the console. The window rose smoothly, sealing off the rest of whatever he'd been about to say, and the car pulled away from the curb, taillights dissolving into the storm, leaving the two of them, standing in the freezing rain in front of a house that no longer had a door. Marcus watched the Volvo disappear down Highgate Crescent. Beside him, Bianca wiped her face with the back of a shaking hand, looked at him with an expression that had nothing soft left in it, and said, Don't talk to me, before walking off alone into the dark, wet street, leaving him standing exactly where his wife had left him, alone, soaked through, and finally, completely understood for what he had always been. He had spent 11 years believing his cruelty was proof of his intelligence. In the end, it was the lock he'd turned against her. So casually, so certain of his own power, that had been the thing to undo him. He had mistaken a quiet woman's patience for weakness, when it had only ever been the long, careful work of someone who had already decided, long before that night, exactly how the story would end, and had simply been waiting, in silence, for the moment he gave her a reason to begin.